All right, let's wrap this conversation about the OSI model up by taking the top 3 layers and discussing them in turn. So the first thing that we did is we went through the physical, the data link, the network, and the transport layer. So that's the first 4 layers. The next set of layers that we're going to have are going to be layer 5, and layer 5 is going to be the session layer. Then above the session layer, we are going to have layer 6, which is going to be the presentation layer. And ultimately, we're going to have the application layer. Now, when we start looking at these layers together, remember we mentioned those PDUs, the data units or the protocol data units that we were discussing. Whenever we're talking about these 3 layers, we call that PDU data. So it comes down from the application, presentation, and session layer as data, and then at layer 3 it becomes, at layer 4 it becomes a segment. So this is at layer 4. So this is at 5 through 7. It's called data. At 4, it's called a segment. At 3, as we already said, it's called a packet. At layer 2, the data link layer, it's called a frame. And at layer 1, it's referred to as bits. So the information that is actually going through. Now, I want you to understand, first of all, that applications are not user applications. These are network applications. These are services like HTTP, HTTP+, FTP, File Transfer Protocol, SMTP, Simple Network, SMTP, so it's going to be Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. And those elements are all considered to be network applications. Now, these network applications are going to have to communicate with one another across our infrastructure, like we said before. So if I have my 2 hosts, and those hosts are connected, like we've been connecting since we started this part of our conversation, the very top of this stack of information is the application layer. And it's going to be between these 2 layers, host to host, that we're going to end up needing to be able to deploy these configurations and deploy these particular setups. Now, what's going to end up happening here is it's going to be at the application layer that we're going to determine what we're going to send. So am I going to send HTTP information? Now keep in mind that if I'm going to send HTTP or HTTPS, understand that the moment that I'm working with HTTP, I've already made the determination that at the transport layer, I'm going to use port 80 to represent that traffic. So it's very important for us to keep the fact that everything is related. So as we go all the way down, everything's going to be good to go. Now, when we look at this next layer, layer 6, which is going to be the presentation layer. So when it comes to the presentation layer does a lot of things for us, but when it comes to my level of interest in this particular course of study is it's going to be responsible for encryption, and it's going to be responsible for de-encryption. So if I want to keep anything that I'm going to be sending via any of these applications that I just described, if I want to keep any of these private, that determination is going to be made at the presentation layer. It's also responsible for formatting information for presentation. It handles translation of configurations. So as an example, if I am talking to, let's say, I can go from like an ASCII configuration, and then at the presentation layer, I could actually convert that to like an IBM IPSIDEC config. So it's going to handle this idea of translation. In fact, I'll just go ahead and put in here, it's going to handle translation. And that's going to be communication translation with regard to the idea of presentation. Now, when it comes to the session layer, which runs underneath the presentation layer, the session layer exists to make certain and to govern how I'm going to send information. And what it's going to do is the session layer is going to allow session establishment. So it's going to be a negotiation of how these devices are going to talk to one another. So how are we going to talk to one another? How are we going to communicate? Questions get asked like, what logical ports am I going to use for this communication? It's also going to be set up here when we start logical ports. Sorry. It's also going to be here at the session layer where I'm going to not just establish, but it's also going to be responsible for teardown. So I'm going to have to de-establish. So once my communications have taken place between host A, host 1, and host 2, it's going to be the responsibility of the session layer to tear down all of those configurations. So keep in mind, it's going to be the session layer that's going to handle the concept of synchronization, and it's going to send information to ports. So this pretty much covers what we need to know in the confines of the OSI model. There are other models that we're going to have to take a serious look at in order to be able to satisfy all of Cisco's tasks and our responsibilities to be able to take and pass the DCICN. And that's going to mean we're going to have to take a look at some of the additional protocol stacks. Keep in mind, like I said from the very, very beginning, the OSI model governed the rules with regard to how devices are going to utilize networking. However, we can still network using a multitude of protocol stacks. As an example, the ones that we are going to concern ourselves with are going to be the IP protocol stack and the TCP protocol stack. There are others, but again, we're only talking about data center and data center employees Ethernet. So until I see you in the next video, I hope this was helpful, and I'd like to thank you for learning data center with me.